Let's start with review criteria for research articles, because there has been a considerable amount written on this, and there's a chapter in Publishing Addiction Science that you've been instructed to read. And we're going to go through a checklist a little bit later that will help you to understand how to conduct a peer review of a journal article. But let's talk about your audience here. Your audience is the people first who submitted the article, and these are the authors. And you want to be respectful, you want to be constructive, you want to be helpful. But you also have, as an audience, other people who are going to be reading your review, other peer reviewers who have been given the same manuscript, and the editor and assistant editors who are going to make the final decision. So this process requires that an editor receive a submission to a journal and then assign it to another editor who has often specialization in that area, who then selects several reviewers. In this case, hypothetically, it could be you, and then you're asked to prepare a review. So again, you need to be respectful to people, you need to be constructive, you need to be helpful, but you need also to be critical. And your job especially is to be critical, not hypercritical, but at least you want to be able to identify fatal flaws and ways to improve the article, and then leave it up to the journal editor to decide whether to accept it or reject it. So let's go through that process, starting with the abstract. The abstract is very important. It communicates a lot of information initially about an article that's been submitted to a journal. And now most journals require structured abstracts, which start with background or aims or objectives, and then a description of the methodology in a few sentences, and then the results and discussion or conclusions. So authors are asked to put this together, and it gives you a pretty good impression of the overall quality of the article. It could be highly sophisticated as a randomized clinical trial, or it could be a descriptive epidemiology study, or it could be a survey, or it could be an uncontrolled case study. You need to look at the abstract and then put your mind in a frame that can critically evaluate it based on what the state of the art is for that particular type of research. So often the abstract also is going to raise questions about the overall study. If they don't mention the number of research participants, that's a red flag, because that should be stated very clearly. If the research design is not clear, if the aims are not particularly important, like we're going to look at some variables, or we're looking at the impact of something on something else, that may not reflect a highly sophisticated type of research design. And often you can pick up fatal flaws just by reading the abstract. So if you are criticizing an article, start with the abstract. Don't form confirmed opinions about whether it's acceptable or rejectable based on just the abstract, but at least get an orientation from it and make sure that the abstract is written in a way that communicates what needs to be known by a reader in order to go further into the article. And it's very important to look at the abstract in terms of its ability to honestly explain what was done in this particular study. And often you'll have to come back to the abstract after you read the whole article to make sure that they haven't overly interpreted the results in a way that is deceptive. The next thing you look at, obviously, is the introduction. That is a way of providing background to the study in several paragraphs. I would be very skeptical of articles that begin with statements like, alcohol abuse is a public health problem. These are cliches which people open up their articles with. They imply that they're just describing their research for an audience that's so broad that it would include anybody. We want people to be writing articles that are focusing on an important question and speaking to an audience that's appropriate to the journal. So generic statements that are opening up a particular article may not be the best way to do it, and certainly you could point that out if it's wasting space by stating the obvious. We want an introduction that describes what is known about the research question, why it's important, and why it was investigated. In the last paragraph of the introduction, you're going to be looking for a rather clear statement after the literature has been reviewed of the hypotheses or why the research was done and why it is important. So you want the introduction to tell a story about why this particular study is important and how the authors are framing the research question. And even sometimes if an introduction is poorly written, that can be redone. That's not a fatal flaw. But the next section, when it comes to the methods, is where the rubber meets the road. You need to be able to evaluate the methods section in terms of whether the methods imply fatal flaws, either in the lack of appropriate description, which would allow other investigators to understand and replicate what was done, or in the case of most articles, to present a research design that is capable of answering the research question stated in the introduction. So often the methods section is what determines the success or failure of a particular article. And you need to look at the methods section very critically. You need to look at it, for example, in terms of whether it includes a description of the research participants and how they were selected and what the inclusion and the exclusion criteria were. You need to be able to evaluate key questions like generalizability and representativeness, and that information should be described both in the methods section and in the beginning of the results section in terms of describing who the participants were. You need to look at the methods critically in terms of whether the research participants were sufficiently numerous in order to generalize to the population and to provide appropriate statistical testing of the hypotheses. So looking at the methods critically requires a set of preconditions that you can apply here. Are the methods adequately described? Are the samples representative so you can generalize the findings? Are the inclusion and exclusion criteria spelled out so you know who was excluded from the study? And was randomization taken into account? And how does that determine whether the research design has sufficient rigor in order to test the hypothesis? The intervention or exposure needs to be described, and obviously the sample size is important in terms of statistical testing. Often power analysis calculations will be described in the method section as well. If people are using standardized measures, which they should be, you need to make sure that there are references to the reliability and validity of the measurements that were used. And in other cases, there are checklists and flowcharts that are important to include, particularly for randomized trials, but now non-randomized observational studies have checklists like the PRISMA guidelines or the CONSORT guidelines that are required by journals. And even if they're not, they're often a good way of looking at a method section in order to see whether the article is covering all of the bases necessary to convince a critical reader that this is a valid evaluation of the research question. The results section is the critical part of the manuscript, and it needs to fully and honestly describe what was done. And it needs to do it in a way that tells a story. Just like the introduction sets out the rationale for the study and suggests how it was done and why it was done and what the hypotheses are, the results section should match up to the introduction in terms of telling a story about how the questions that were raised in the introduction have been answered. So sometimes it's best to get right to the point. After describing what the sample is, report the primary outcomes and make sure that you can illustrate the outcomes or make sure the authors have illustrated the outcomes in terms of appropriate tables and figures. The tables should not be trivial. They shouldn't have one column describing percentages and ends. They should probably be a little bit more detailed in giving the reader an understanding of what the data look like. And then in a more sophisticated way, go into the higher level statistical tests, which either confirm or disconfirm the hypotheses. So what you want to see in a good results section is attention to detail, but also attention to laying out the results in a logical, reasonable way that honestly presents the findings. And non-essential details can be left out. We don't want interpretation of the results. We just want them stated clearly, and they should match on to the aims and the methods. The next part to look at critically is the discussion. So the discussion should provide an overview initially in the first couple of sentences, but they don't need to repeat what's in the introduction. They need to state what the principal findings are in an objective way. Then the authors should get into the details, the possible mechanisms that help to explain the findings, the strengths and the weaknesses of the study. And there should not be an attempt to hide them. Reviewers appreciate an honest appraisal of strengths and weaknesses. And if the authors don't state them, you can be sure that critical reviewers are going to pick this up. And that's your job as a critical reviewer, to look at weaknesses, but also to appreciate the strengths. Finally, the article in its discussion should develop potential implications for clinicians or policymakers or epidemiologists or whoever the audience is, and can spell out further unanswered questions and future research. But for the most part, the discussion should summarize everything and end with conclusions about the value of the study and how it advances knowledge. Remember that your job is to not only criticize the study, but to help an editor find excellent studies or interesting studies or important studies to report to the field. And if you think the study was well done, but it's trivial, then you can state that. And you have to remember that the authors are going to be reading this, but maybe you can suggest how they can improve their article by perhaps developing things further. And that's certainly within the realm of a critical reviewer. Your job is not to help the authors get their article accepted, it's to help the scientific decision-making that goes into selecting the best research or doing justice to a data set which hasn't been appropriately developed. So once an editor gets reviews from 2 or 3 critical reviewers, the editor sits back and looks at the article, looks at the critiques, and compares the consistency among the reviewers, also takes into account perhaps another reading by somebody else in the field, like an assistant editor whose area that person has specialized in, and takes into account the mission of the journal and the criteria that are often unstated for selecting articles. If you remember what goes on inside the black box of an editor's decision-making in publishing addiction science, you remember that importance and originality are two criteria. Obviously, editors want studies that are free of fatal flaws. They want studies that are methodologically appropriate. They want studies where the statistical analyses have been done in a sophisticated way and not overinterpreted. But when all that comes together, sometimes a paper won't be accepted because it's not necessarily that important or not innovative or original. And that's good information for you to have in order to make your own research more competitive. You need to be always looking ahead to not just designing a study that's got all of these criteria fulfilled, but you want your studies, if it's in a grant application, to be considered important and original, and therefore a cut above the competition. And if it has fatal flaws, then it's unlikely to be accepted under any circumstances. If it has flaws that are acknowledged or correctable, and at the same time it's important and original, that may lead to the acceptance or a recommendation on your part for acceptance. But it's up to the editor to balance important and originality with the methodology. And that depends on the journal's philosophy and the space available. Many good articles don't get published. Many good grant applications don't get funded because there's not enough space or not enough money. And the quality of the competition is important. So you have to think in terms of what would be the standard for this particular field. Has this type of research already been done, or is this study adding something new? And if you're able to critique articles from that perspective, you're going to be in a much better position to understand how to write your own grant applications. So when it comes to critiquing articles, there's a checklist which we will be making available to you that can serve as a guide for a peer reviewer of a journal article. And it consists of about 15 questions plus an evaluation of the statistical analyses and a recommendation. And the recommendations usually are things like accept the article as it is, which is quite rare, accept it with some revisions, accept it with major revisions, or consider accepting it or rejecting it outright. And it's up to the editor to decide based on a lot of other information, but the reviewer's input is often critical to the decision that an editor makes. And to do that, the checklist is valuable. Is the research question clearly defined? Is it as important? Is the abstract accurate and balanced and complete based on your reading of the manuscript? Is the design appropriate to the question? And in some cases, randomized trials are not possible. Observational studies or descriptive studies are fine. If the research question is unique or interesting or important. Are research ethics taken into account? Did this study go through IRB approval if it involves human participants? Are the outcomes clearly defined and measured? Are statistics used appropriately? Are the references up to date and appropriate? Do the results address the research questions in the way that they're presented in the introduction? is the discussion and conclusions justified by the results? And are the limitations adequately described? So all of these things are important criteria to use in evaluating a paper submitted to a journal. And the best way to get that experience is to work with somebody who does journal reviews. As somebody who's established in the field who gets requests for journals, it's a great way of learning how to do things. If you have a mentor, all you need to do is suggest that you'd be happy to work on and collaborate on reviews that may be sent to that mentor. And by going through that process, you're going to learn an awful lot.